Jim Johnson, former chief of prosecutions at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, has been named prosecutor of the Residual Special Court, which means you have a brick. There will be a brick forthcoming at the Jackson Center.
The only reason I wanted to become prosecutor.
So I know they've ordered it, Jim. I don't want it to be a surprise, but it'll be an appropriate ceremony. Maybe in 10 feet of snow, but it'll be appropriate. Was your mom, dad, family members, were you into law? Were they into law? Was this something?
No.
Do you know what gravitated you to this game?
When I was very, very young, my mother was a legal secretary. Mm-hmm. For a lawyer back in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he owned some property, and my dad worked for him as well. And for some reason, that just appealed to me. And that's what made me decide that, well, maybe that's what I want to do.
Now, you graduated from what college?
University of Nebraska.
Go Cornhuskers.
Yep.
And likewise law school?
Likewise law school.
Oh, a double corn.
Growing up in rural Nebraska, you didn't understand that there were actually schools outside of Nebraska.
So now you're in the Big Ten. My God.
That's right.
How does that compute? I mean, you're not in the conference with Oklahoma.
I still think we're in the Big Eight.
Yeah.
I'm not with the times. I miss the Big Eight.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. The old rivalries seem to be gone, and I haven't really caught up with the new ones.
So during your time there at Nebraska, was Bob Devaney, was he the athletic director?
Probably.
Yeah.
Because Tom Osborne was coach when I was my entire time at the University of Nebraska. Yep.
And Oklahoma was Switzer?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think so.
You think about those legendary guys,
We used to, every Sunday morning, I was with Pershing Rifles, an ROTC fraternity, and every Sunday morning after a home game, the Pershing Rifles, we were in there cleaning the stadium.
Oh, is that right?
That's how we earned money for the organization, was to clean Memorial Stadium the morning after a home game.
Did you have any role during the game as security or anything like that?
Oh, well, actually, we, again, as part of Pershing Rifles, we served as parking lot attendants at one of the parking lots before the home games.
You were? Okay, perfect. Now, Pershing Rifles, what was that? Was that part of a ROTC program?
It was a ROTC fraternity.
Yeah.
Named after John J. Pershing. Yep.
And as part of the Pershing Rifles, so therefore you were kind of service bound before you decided to go to law school?
I was undergraduate, ROTC scholarship.
Right.
Yep. And so yes, I knew I was going to have a 4-year commitment after from undergrad I went on education delay to serve my 4 years and to go to law school. And then of course as my 3rd year of law school, I applied and was accepted into the Judge Advocate General's Corps, and after law school, went into the Army.
So you went in the Army and be part of the JAG Corps. What part of the JAG duties did you like the most? I mean, did you find that it was the most interesting and compelling? You got various aspects. You got the administrative, prosecution side. You got a variety of things.
Well, criminal law and then international law.
Yeah.
And so, of course, as a young judge advocate, you get exposed to a lot of areas. And those were the 2 areas that I most enjoyed, was when I served as a trial counsel, and then, of course, moved into international law. And that was what I enjoyed.
Give me an example of what the international law might be. So would it be a military individual on a base, let's say in Germany, that kicks in there? It's more of an international scene?
Well, I think what you're referring to there are status of forces issues and the status of American servicemen, women, and their families overseas in Germany. part of the NATO Status Forces Agreement. But no, my interest lied in the laws of war. And the laws of operational law, we called it in sometimes, but it really had to do with the conduct of your activities and in being in compliance with international humanitarian law and the laws of war, and how to conduct your operations so that they satisfy and you stay on the right side of international humanitarian law.
Was there a best practices booklet that you folks created?
Yes, the field manual, I think it was 2710, Law of War field manual, and that was kind of probably our number one source of information, but really is just understanding and learning the Hague Rules, the Geneva Conventions, advising commanders on operations, advising commanders on rules of engagement, and teaching it to soldiers.
So when it came to actual operations itself, and they're in the field of battle, would they bring your group in to say, we're contemplating X, Y, and Z, is this legal? Well,
this is, and this has only really grown during the time I was in the service and has since left. But yes, you have attorneys assigned in the Army, sometimes down as far as brigade level, certainly at divisional level, and they are part of the operations cell. They review operations, review targeting, and of course this is very, very, and has taken the center stage in the last 20 years, really, when you talk about the war on terror, in that the legal review of targeting and the legal review of operations, again, to make sure that you are complying with the laws of armed conflict.
As a JAG, you're in an advisory capacity,
yes.
And there's a command, chain of command. So your opinion, albeit advisory, may or may not be complied with.
That's true. That's true. Fortunately, we find that commanders are usually very, very interested in what their judge advocates have to say. Yeah.
I remember you brought in to the International Humanitarian Law Dialogue a few of those folks who were in that, either receiving that advice or not, and I interviewed them, but also they're all embargoed at this point. I can't air them if I wanted to.
At some point, maybe
yeah.
There's a 40-year rule there, but at some point.
Well, it was fascinating. I must tell you, it was just great. They were super straightforward, and only when they retire. So I look at Wikipedia occasionally to see if they've retired. So you're part of the JAG program, and how does all of a sudden you find yourself, you have an interest in international law, international humanitarian law, rules of engagement, then you find yourself in this world of Sierra Leone and David Crane and guys like that. How does that all work?
Well, of course, David Crane and I have known each other. We go back to 1983.
Through the JAG program?
Yes, yes. My first duty posting was Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I was with Special Operations Command. Dave Crane at the time was with 82nd Airborne.
Okay.
And so we got to know each other. We were not in the same office, but we got to know each other because we were judge advocates on the same installation, although Fort Bragg is a very large installation with a good number of judge advocates on it, but we got to know each other. And then the second time that we really got to know each other was when I was accepted. I became a professor at the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General School in the International and Operational Law Department. And I became a professor in 1992 and 1993. Dave Crane joined as chair of that department. So Dave was my immediate supervisor at that time. And so we worked together for 3 years, teaching judge advocates, teaching senior commanders the lawyer's role in international operational law, as well as teaching them the basics of it. And so we taught a good number of young judge advocates coming through, as well as mid-level judge advocates that were there for the graduate program.
Did you find that you and David sort of found certain niches where you became somewhat, I don't want to say specialist, but more likely to teach this course and David this course?
Well, Dave, of course, was the chair of the department, so Dave did a little bit of it all. My principal area was the Geneva Conventions and Hague Conventions. Hague Rules was the principal areas that I taught in. But all of us in the department were prepared, and we would teach any aspect of it as necessary. But very much the role of judge advocates in advising commanders in armed conflict. You're
in the Army at this point, and of course things are happening internationally in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, on the ground, United Nations involvement. Did you follow much of that at the time?
Well, yes. One, it was part of another part of my portfolio, so to speak, along with the Geneva and Hague Conventions, was peacekeeping operations and United Nations operations. And so that was another aspect of my duties. But also, while I was at the Judge Advocate General School, I was part of a program called Expanded IMINT, International Education and Assistance. And so I traveled to a number of countries in Africa teaching international humanitarian law to soldiers, civilian leaders, and commanders in those countries, including Sierra Leone.
Yeah, right.
I had traveled to Sierra Leone, 2 or 3 times between 92 and 96. I can't remember the exact dates at that time, but of course that was when the conflict was kicking off in Sierra Leone. Yeah. And I was part of a program that it was controlled out of the Naval Justice School, and part of a program that had judge advocates from all of our services, Army, Air Force, and Navy, Marines, that would travel into countries all over the world to teach this. And I traveled to a number of countries in Africa, including South Africa, one of the first U.S. military teams that went into South Africa to train after apartheid, several countries in Africa, as well as Uzbekistan. And so that gave me an exposure to more in this area.
Wow, no idea. As part of that, just going back to Sierra Leone, you're there, you're an advisor, you're on the ground, and you're seeing things, you're reading about things, you're hearing things about what maybe the Charles Taylor infiltration, Civil War. Did you get a sense that this was going to erupt to what you ultimately saw?
That's a hard question to answer. I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that question. Yeah. It was certainly it started out as this thing happening up in the provinces, and you started seeing it grow a little bit, but I can't say I anticipated that it would become what it did, particularly when you look at the level of international humanitarian law violations, the attack on Freetown that happened, I believe it was early 1999, number of years, of course, after I was there. And so, no, I don't think you anticipated that it would become what it did.
At the same time, there were things going on in Rwanda, which subsequently became also a tribunal unto itself. Did you follow that as well in the United Nations kind of snafu, I'd say? I mean, that's my term after the fact, but kind of not really.
Well, certainly, sure. At the time I was a professor at the Judge Advocate General School, that was within our mandate to follow that and to advise and teach judge advocates coming through the school of what was going on and what was happening there. And of course, we're seeing the beginnings of war crimes trials in the modern era. And so very much we followed that.
Did you ever sense that that would be a direction one Jim Johnson
Probably
went?
didn't anticipate in 1995 and 1996 that eventually I might become one of these tribunals. I don't know that I gave that a thought.
Well, you think about it, I mean, that's the time of the Richard Goldstones and just
Yeah.
the beginning of the tribunals. And did your paths cross with those guys, Sharif Bassioni, folks that were sort of...
No, not at that time.
Yeah.
Not at that time.
Yeah. What was the United States sort of position at that time? I mean, again, you're in the JAG program, but at the same time, there's policy going on.
Well, certainly, you look at the United States and our support of really both of those tribunals, but in particular the Yugoslavian tribunal. The United States was one of the principal supporters and actors behind the creation of the Yugoslavian tribunal, to the extent that, both in practical and political support in making it happen. The United States, oh gosh, the number was in the tens of armed forces and Department of Justice lawyers that were seconded to the tribunal in its very early days to try and give it a jump start and moving. So the United States was extremely supportive of those tribunals, and like I say, probably one of the leaders in seeing them created.
At some point, David Crane, he's told us stories several times about how he got the call. Did you similarly get the call from David?
I think the first time, yes, I think almost a year before I joined the tribunal, I got a call from Dave and he said, this might happen, and this might come together, and would you be interested in being a part of it if it did come together?
And Pam's answer was?
Supportive.
She's the best. But that you're starting with something which has, you got things going on in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the tribunals there have just started. They're working their way through it, and David's really essentially got to start something with whole cloth.
Yeah. It had been, well, at this point in time, you're looking, it had been 6 to 7 years since Rwanda was established. And so you had a little bit of gap between Rwanda and Sierra Leone. Lots of lessons learned on the creation of the tribunals, funding the tribunals, maybe not necessarily the right lessons were learned when it came to funding the tribunals. But yeah, in many respects, he tried to take the best he could from those tribunals and bring it to the operation of the Office of the Prosecutor at Sierra Leone.
What was your role there? What did David envision your role would be, and then what did it become?
Okay, well, initially I came as, when I initially joined the tribunal, I was the senior trial attorney for one of the 3 trial teams. Well, at that time it was 2 trial teams. We had 2 trial teams. One of them was to, of course, take the lead in the investigation and if evidence was there, prosecution of the Civil Defense Forces, which was the trial team I assumed responsibility for. And the other trial team was to, of course, investigate and prosecute the rebel forces. At that time, it was they were combining, or thought it would be a joint trial for the AFRC and RUF rebel forces. Eventually, we pretty quickly determined that we were going to be going with 2 trials against the AFRC and the RUF, and so 2 trial teams were then created. So I was senior trial attorney leading one of the trial teams against the Civil Defense Forces.
Who was the other one?
Pardon?
Who was the other attorney?
At the time, Robert Petit came in as leading the trial team against the AFRC and RUF.
Wow, small
Yeah.
world, huh?
It certainly is. It certainly is. Robert had come out of I believe he'd come out of East Timor was his experience at that time, if I recall.
Right.
And then, of course, Robert stayed with us for just over a year, maybe 15 months, somewhere in there. And then, of course, eventually moved on to Cambodia.
When did Sir Desmond join you?
Well, Desmond was there from the beginning.
Was he?
Oh, and I guess I really didn't finish answering your first question. Within about 2 years of when I was there, the chief of prosecutions was, he was looking at leaving in that year.
Oh.
And so when Luke left, really in the fall of 2005, then I applied and moved up to the chief of prosecutions, which meant that for the remainder of my time with the special court, I was the chief of prosecutions, and so I supervised all of the trial teams. We had at that time 3 trial teams. Then, of course, we eventually set up a separate trial team for Charles Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were, at our height, we had 4 different trial teams. And in 2008, as we were starting to wind down a little bit, we were past the 3 of our trials, we were past the prosecution phases into the defense phases. And so so when the chief of investigations left in 2008, then I assumed investigations under my mandate as well, and supervised the investigation section. And then, of course, later down the line, when the deputy left, then I assumed the responsibilities of the deputy as well. We did not replace the deputy. And so although my top role was still as that of chief of prosecutions, but I essentially assumed the responsibilities of deputy for the remainder of my time there, in addition to my other duties.
You really were the number 2 guy.
For some of it, yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
Being in that role, it sounds like it's a master where you almost have a board, whiteboard, and you're kind of working. All right, we got to do X, Y, and Z. It's a lot of managing your assets, managing your talent. Is that it? Did you find yourself in court often?
Not a lot in court, particularly after I became chief of prosecutions.
Yeah.
We had, of course, the trial teams, and so yeah, it was ensuring that my 4 trial teams had the resources they needed to conduct the trials, and we were never a court with abundance of personnel.
Yeah.
And so we were very lean in many respects on personnel, both in the investigations and prosecutions. We would consistently have to move personnel between trial teams to be able to keep up. And then, of course, eventually, as our trial team started winding down, as the trials started concluding, then of course that helped a little bit in the sense of we were able to reposition some attorneys onto other trial teams as we needed to do so. And then of course also oversaw a lot of the downsizing, just as we no longer needed personnel to do the job. And of course reducing the size of the office.
You have offices in 2 locations, Freetown and The Hague.
We did.
And did you have trials other than Charles Taylor at The Hague? Or was
No,
everything else
no.
in Freetown?
Everything was at Freetown except for Charles Taylor. That's right.
Was that, as being chief of prosecutions of the special court for Sierra Leone, of course, that you had Taylor? I mean, so you got not only activities going on in Freetown and also activities at The Hague. Did you feel stretched?
Well, I don't know that we necessarily thought about it in that way.
I mean, you're kind of...
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, I think no more than we felt stretched the entire time of the court.
Yeah.
Because, one of the, the special court of Sierra Leone was always envisioned to be a court that would get in, do its job in a quicker manner than the other tribunals, because of course at the time we were created, the other tribunals had now been going on for a number of years with no end in sight. And so we were always envisioned as being a tribunal with a more limited mandate, in that our mandate was just to try those that bared the greatest responsibility. So from the very beginning, we knew we were only going after the very, very senior leaders. And so I don't know if we felt any more stretched by having a trial in another location up in The Hague. It just, we just juggled the resources to the extent that we could.
Charles Taylor, you indicted him, and ultimately we know the story of the extradition, flying in the helicopter, and all of that ceremony, which was unbelievably great story, which has been told by you and Desmond.
Oh, you asked about Desmond, when Desmond was there from the very beginning.
Yeah. Let's pause for a second. Give me your best Desmond De Silva story.
Oh, gosh.
Or two.
I don't know that I can. Desmond was just, I don't know if I've ever enjoyed working with anyone more than I enjoyed working with Desmond. He was a tremendous individual. Desmond was bigger than life. And I don't know that I could give you a story. Just the big perspective. He was incredible.
Well, I'll give you one. So when we first had our international law dialogue, it might have been year 1 or 2, Sir Desmond was here. And of course, what I'd like to do is interview them, and he had to walk up at Chautauqua, a flight of stairs, walk through a room into a kind of an office where I conducted the interviews. Well, it just so happened that Interchamber had a group of bellboys, were preparing for the day's activity, just sitting there. So we're walking through, and I did one of these, hi, how are you? Maybe there were 7 or 8 of them. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Sir Desmond De Silva, just kind of an introductory thing. He stops, and in his best British accent, gives him a 10-minute story as to who he is and why he's there and so glad. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, they don't want to hear from you. But he just couldn't help himself. It was spectacular.
And you say his best British accent, you have to remember that was
him.
That was him, that's right. He wasn't giving an accent. That was Desmond.
Oh, it was just such a thrill to have him in our midst. While we're talking war stories and personnel, I had a chance to interview your chief of investigations, apparently, Alan White.
Yes, Alan.
I bet there's a story with Alan. He seems like a guy out of Indiana Jones.
I guess I'm not a storyteller.
That's okay. You're protecting. You're good. But Alan told some stories.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
It was amazing.
I was there through July of 2005.
Was that right?
Yeah. Yeah, he was on from the first and was with the court for 3 years.
Was he?
Yeah.
Well, he had unique stories. I'm curious, Jim, I mean, you're chief of prosecutions, you're masterminding all the prosecutions, but the Taylor case, because of its visibility, did that take on a little bit of a more degree of consternation or focus as opposed to the other ones, which at the same time were sort of winding down? Did you feel the pressure?
I mean, certainly you realized that, the Taylor was certainly the biggest case. The Taylor was certainly the case that drew the most attention to the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And which in some ways it's unfortunate, because you look at the other cases that the severity of those cases, the things that happened, and of course Taylor was always in the background when you're looking at those cases. But I can't say that. I mean, I guess that's always on your mind. But you know, we had at our height, we had 4 cases going. Mm-hmm. And the CDF case was really very much winding down by the time the Taylor case started. Trying to remember if we were still in the defense phase, or we may have even been in the appeals phase by the time the Taylor case started. The timeline, have to recall the timeline. But no, I mean, we certainly we weren't going to let the Taylor case take anything away from the other cases. Or we weren't going to, like, as I mentioned, we always had to be adjusting our resources and our manpower to meet the needs and where it was greatest at the time, but not ever to the extent that we would have sacrificed our other cases. And so you knew the Taylor case was the most visible, and you knew the Taylor case is what was getting the Special Court for Sierra Leone into the news. Mm-hmm. And of course, we were prosecuting a head of state, or a former head of state by the time we prosecuted him, a head of state at the time we indicted him. And so that's naturally the case. You're concerned about that and watching it. But I wouldn't say it was to the detriment of the other cases.
The Taylor case turned out to be the first conviction of a head of state since Nuremberg and Admiral Dönitz.
Yes.
As the answer to the question, name the 2 Führers of the Third Reich. Did you either in your earlier JAG education, or even as preparation for these cases, does the Nuremberg trial, Jackson, did you guys study it? Did it become kind of a help to you as far as procedure, anything like that? Does that?
Certainly studied it. Yeah. Certainly understood it and appreciated it. But by the time we came in 2002, when the Special Court was, of course, created and stood up, we had a lot of that jurisprudence had been litigated at ICTY and ICTR. Mm. So we didn't rely directly on Nuremberg as those tribunals did, and in looking at creating the jurisprudence, creating the elements of the crime, looking at the procedures that were being used. So in that sense, that's what we relied on, was the jurisprudence coming out of ICTY and ICTR. So no, not so much. I do think that what's interesting is that when you talk about Nuremberg, and of course you spend your time dealing with attorneys that have an international law background. They're there trying these cases because they want to be there. And what's interesting is they all knew Jackson. They all knew Nuremberg. Mm-hmm. In many respects, they knew more about Jackson, more about Justice Jackson, than I think I would find your average American knows about Justice Jackson. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of, you kind of think, this is sad. Yeah. You really do. I mean, now granted, I was in the middle of a community that, looks up to Justice Jackson and looks up to what he did and looks up to the precedent of Nuremberg. So they're expected to know who Justice Jackson was. But they did. Yeah. They all did, and respected him for what he did.
It's, as you've hit the nail on the head as far as somewhat sad. One thing that continues to be the charge of the Jackson Center, of course, is to get that word out. There's not a lot of misinformation about Jackson. There's just not a lot of information about Jackson.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair statement. Yep.
You're not dealing with negatives. You're just kind of dealing with, you probably don't know about this guy, but let's tell you about him. So first time I met you, you were a guest. You were a guest here as a representative of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Sent here, was it, I don't know if it was by Brenda at the time, but as a representative. So they tell you, go to the Jackson Center for the first time. What did you think?
Gosh, that was a long time ago. Well, I think my first thought was, what is this?
Yeah.
What is the Jackson Center? And quite frankly, what is Chautauqua Institution?
Right.
Because that was where it was being held.
Right.
And so my first thought was, of course, Robert H. Jackson was not new to me. I knew Robert H. Jackson very well, or knew of him and his work, but yeah, just a little research. Where am I going? What is this all about? But yeah, because in that sense, I'm absolutely sure I had not heard of the Jackson Center up until that time when I was preparing to come here for my first dialogues.
And probably one of the first folks you met was Carol Drake.
Well, probably one of the first ones, yes. In fact, if I recall that first trip from the airport, I think Rod picked me up, come to think of it.
Carol had him working a lot.
That's right. I think Rod picked me up, and of course I had dealt with Carol getting here.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so you were here at really David's request and sent, was Brenda the chief at the time, or was Stephen?
Gosh, again, let's see. When was my first trip here was in 2010. And so Brenda was recently appointed prosecutor. Yes, Brenda was prosecutor at my first trip here. That's right.
Probably put it on the record here, but Brenda Hollis meant nothing to me. And I remember David Crane, we always tell the story of the first time when the International Law Dialogues got started at Bowling Green. We met at a conference and we talked, and the person we walked out together during the course of her speech to go have coffee to talk about what turned out to be the law dialogues was Brenda's. Because I'm there with this, capturing moments, and as it turned out, I kept it on because I forgot that I kept it on. So I have Brenda Hollis speaking at Bowling Green, and it meant nothing at the time, but of course she became,
Well, and Brenda was, as I mentioned earlier, those attorneys that were seconded to the ICTY in the very, very early days. Yeah. Brenda was one of those. Yeah.
So it's a crazy small world. Do you, this isn't a sidebar, it's a pretty small fraternity. The International Criminal Law Prosecution alums is a pretty small one.
Yes, that's true.
And getting smaller, in the sense that there's certainly virtually no active ones except you and a couple of others. There are just very few.
Well, yeah, that's right. When you look at it, of course, you have the ICC, Cambodia, the MICT, and Sierra Leone and Lebanon.
Yeah.
That's right. And you'll now the residual mechanisms, the MICT and residual special court will be around for a while. Cambodia is very much. You have to wonder is Cambodia doing some of their last judicial work right now with the appeal, with the pending appeal, and it's looking less and less likely that there will be additional trials in Cambodia. And of course, Lebanon is in their end stage as well. They're getting there.
Have they announced the judgments?
Yeah.
Lebanon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to probably be you and the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court will be the picture of two people.
Well, you'll have the MICT.
Yeah, true.
And I don't know what the talk is about what kind of residual mechanisms will be there for Cambodia and Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And so that's still a possibility. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's very few right now. You have two Americans, of course, Brenda and I. Nick Kumjian is the head of the mechanism that's been set up to look at Myanmar, but it's an investigative mechanism. It's not a tribunal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I remember how we've always had the picture at the International Humanitarian Now Law Roundtable, where you have the sitting chief prosecutors and then circling with those who were former. I mean, that's
Yep,
been the
yep.
picture. And I remember the last one we did at the Chautauqua, there was just 2 or 3, and we knew that at some point it would be just, at the time, Fatu, there'd be one, and everybody else would be standing around her. It was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but fairly impressive. Jim, you ended up deciding you were going to retire from the service,
Yes.
and then shortly thereafter, an opportunity presented itself here. How did that all happen? I'm not sure.
Well, as I mentioned, Dave gave me a call,
Yeah.
and I was still almost a year out from retirement. And Dave, of course, at the time was really exploring the possibility if the Judge Advocate General Corps would second an attorney or two to the tribunal. And that's why, that was one of the reasons he called me, was to see if he could achieve that, if I would be interested in doing that. And I was certainly interested. The idea very, very much appealed to me. But that didn't happen. And then, of course, as I said, I was coming up on retirement eligible. And so the timing just worked out. I retired from the Army. In fact, I wasn't even retired yet when I got on the plane to go to Sierra Leone. The last month I was on retirement leave, that before you retire, and I got on the plane and was in Sierra Leone on the 5th of January 2003.
Hi, golly.
Yeah.
So, at some point, you end up here, and I mean, you've been here for the law dialogues, and you explained to Pam, well, I may take this job in Jamestown, New York, which means we have to move to Jamestown, New York, which may be close to what it was like in Nebraska, but nevertheless. What was her reaction?
Very enthusiastic, I guess. I'd say, you know, at this point in time, we had been overseas for 16 years.
Yeah.
And, 6.5 years in the Army, 9.5 years with the Special Court. And, of course, Pam remained in Germany when I was with the Special Court. And so we were ready to come back to the U.S.
And be a couple again.
Well, we had been generally living apart now for going on 10 years, that's right. And so it was time. I got home when I could. She got down to Sierra Leone when it made sense.
Yeah.
But it was time to come home. We'd been overseas a long time.
So when the Jackson Center, what was your sense of the center at the time? You came on, you were the president's chief executive officer, 2012, 13?
12, yep, summer of 2012.
Yeah. And what was your sense of it at the time, as from an organizational perspective?
Well, I was very, it was one of those things where I was very impressed with the work that had been done to get the center the center was 10 years old at the time, maybe just over 10, or at least from the initial conception of the center, over 10. But we, of course, one of the first things we did under my watch was to celebrate our 10th anniversary with the Chief Justice. But just extremely impressed on, first of all, the dedicated people that were part of it. I think that was a big thing. It was just people that really, really had an idea of what the center could be, and how far it had come. And so, no, we were very, very pleased to get here.
You mentioned the fact under your watch, Chief Justice Roberts came here. What did you look now? That's a big deal. What did you think about not only the preparation for but ultimately his arrival? I mean, do you have impressions as you talk about it today?
Well, maybe nothing other than just that, this isn't something that happened overnight. You'd been working this now for 6 years, I believe, is a fair statement. certainly since he was appointed to the court. And so this is the kind of thing that doesn't happen overnight. And the logistical challenge of that was pretty immense in making all of that come together.
Well, we appreciated your military preciseness because we needed to do that. And I remember even you, as you're laying out the hours of, literally minutes, not minute time for not hours, it was all in military time. and we needed that. It worked out fabulously, Jim, and your credit to just the organizational skills. Right, the logistics of getting so many people at the Athenaeum Hotel, so many people here.
A lot of moving pieces had to come together. And you have to remember that, as the Jackson Center always has been, it's a small staff, a very, very small staff. And so you've got a lot to do with a few people. Fortunately, we had a lot of terrific volunteers that stepped up and made it happen, because otherwise you don't make something like that happen. One of the
continued programs which kind of stepped it up a level when you were part of it was the law dialogues. And do you get a sense, did you spend some time with David saying how we might even alter or ramp up or even take it to another level? I must tell you, just as an aside, I guess, when we did the first one, 2007, yeah, wow. I really thought it was a one-off. I mean, just thought, there's Ocampo. We had all the names that we wanted to have just about there, but I thought that was it. And then David and Whitney actually sat on a porch, and myself and said, should we do it again? And here we are with your leadership, especially your leadership now. We're going on to our 13th, 14th year, which is remarkable.
Yes, unfortunately, next year will be 13 with a gap year, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. One virtual year. But
yeah.
Did you get a sense of, just as you're planning this, Jim, how you envisioned, how it could, maybe take a different impression?
Well, I think from the very beginning, or at least from when I got here, and this is something that Dave and I started bouncing off of each other in the very early, right from the time I got to the Jackson Center, and you were even involved in some of those discussions, but knowing that the dialogues would have to evolve. Because, one of the reasons the dialogues were so successful was because it brought in, the prosecutors wanted to keep coming. They wanted to keep coming for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was that it was their only chance, really, to get together in a group together and to discuss issues that were current, to discuss issues that they all had in common, and to discuss those issues, how to do their jobs better. And then there was a socialization aspect of it too. Just some of the social interaction with the prosecutors and with the few that were there to, you didn't get that very often. And so it had a great appeal. But from very early on, we started to identify that this can't continue forever. Eventually, we're going to have tribunals closing down. And so where can the dialogues, or what should the dialogues become down the road? They should, we had the declaration, which was great, and a statement by all the prosecutors. Again, this was the only forum that made that possible, and the only way that the prosecutors as a group could get their thoughts out there onto the world stage. And so the declaration was very, very good and appealing across the board in that respect. But still, we know the tribunals are going to wind down. We know that eventually there may only be one, unless there's another ad hoc created, there may only be one active international tribunal. And so we had to start thinking, what should this evolve to? And eventually, as you see, it evolved to the roundtable, which we had for the first time in 2019, and unfortunately for the second time in 2021 without one in 2020. But also it goes to show that we for the first time in 2016 We took the dialogues on the road, and we went to Nuremberg to recognize the significant anniversary, the 70th anniversary of the verdict. And of course, we were taking them to London in 2020 and now in 2021 to recognize the 75th anniversary of the London Agreement, I guess 75 plus 1 when we ultimately get there. But I think what's interesting is as we moved to the roundtable format, is an understanding that that we might have to open the dialogues up a little bit more. We might have to expand the base for the dialogues, and taking the dialogues on the road every now and then is a good idea. And it gets I'm still saying dialogues, taking the round table on the road every now and then is a good idea. And we're very much looking forward to 2021 when, of course, we're going to have the, being in London, where in many respects it all started, being close in proximity to The Hague, which I think will bring attendance to the round table that we wouldn't otherwise have available to us. But then we still have the challenge of deciding just what's the right size for the round table. How far can we open it up? How big do we make it? And with what we're going through right now with the COVID and a much greater dependence on webinars, we also have to decide, well, to what extent do we want to take advantage of that with the round table? Sure. And so a lot of questions going forward with the round table, but I think you're seeing a natural evolution of it that was inevitable as we see the tribunals closing down.
Well, what you and Pam did for the Nuremberg was short of outstanding. Just to be able to orchestrate all of that, but that was magic. That was really magic when we went there. Well,
and the only reason Nuremberg came off was because we had the support from the courtroom memoriam. We had support from the documentation center, and we had support from the city of Nuremberg. Yeah. And so that's how that happened, and that's why that happened, because they were very much supportive of us, and you know, we brought an element to the 70th anniversary of the verdict that they wouldn't have had otherwise, because we brought the prosecutors, and including the Attorney General of the United States, when you think about it.
Loretta Lynch, that's right.
Yeah.
That was cool. That was really cool. During your time as president, you had a chance, we have a lot of programs. We sort of been our grist is to have programs. Do you remember meeting some folks that came in that may be of note?
Well, of course, Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was probably one of the high points.
Sure. And
the chance to meet her and escort her, give her a tour of the Jackson Center.
Talk about that a little bit. I mean, how did it happen, and what was she like?
Well, you know, just a very personable, but yet very, you know, as I recall, very serious and very interested and very, very engaged. And if I remember, you know, it was Chautauqua, that, of course, her visit to Chautauqua, and your connections and our connections with Chautauqua, and seeing that the invitation to the Jackson Center was relayed to her. And it was, you know, gosh, that was how many years ago now? That was 13?
Yeah.
So over 7 years ago now that you're looking at it. So it's hard to remember the specific conversations that we had. But you know, I do remember just her being very engaged with her throughout the entire tour.
Well, great pictures you have, and great memories. And I know Sheriff Babcock, you know, was part of that. I think she probably brought her down.
She brought her down and joined us through the tour, as I remember. Yeah.
But by the way, just a sidebar, there's a great picture that was taken, I'm sure by Pam, of Shara and Justice Ginsburg looking at the Jackson books of Gail Jarrell, that first, autographed book and stuff like that. Well, I sent that to Gail, and she went bananas because that's her books. Just to the side.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Ginsburg, that's pretty good. Roberts, I mean, you're just sort of hanging with the big dogs.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, again, it all kind of blends together. But Korematsu and Karen,
Yes.
meeting her was just fun.
Yeah.
And spending a little time with her was just a lot of fun. And I know I'm leaving some of them out, but when you got to meet a lot of terrific people, and we had some great speakers coming through. That again, it's hard to say when you have so many like that. It's hard to say which one stands out.
Well, I remember when we had Christy Yamaguchi.
Oh yes.
You opened up the place, and all of a sudden there's Christy Yamaguchi, and who knew that her grandmother, I'm doing the interview thinking ice skating.
Yep.
And we had the Korematsu exhibit,
Yep.
and she immediately talked about her grandmother being in an internment.
I remember that.
And her mother being born there. It's like, whoa, this is really personal.
Yeah.
That was cool. And then of course we did have the Olympians come another year.
We did. That's right. In advance of the skating show that I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember some very, very good conversations with them as we toured the Jackson Center, and a lot of interest in particularly the Nuremberg trials and the modern trials.
Yes. Well, anyways, you just have added such value, Jim. There, here we are going on to our 20th anniversary, and Kristen McMahon is our new president, CEO. And if you had to give some kind of maybe advice, and I know that's not often easy to do, but kind of look at a crystal ball saying, all right, we're celebrating the 20th. On the 25th, it would be great if we were here. What would you say to Kristen?
Oh gosh. I think that the maybe not advice to what here is on the 25th, but maybe some advice in knowing what you want here to be. Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest challenges when you've got with the Jackson Center is knowing where you want to go. Mm-hmm. In other words, not getting distracted on your quest to get there, and remembering your core mission. I mean, I looked at the most recent mission statement, which is on the website, which is a great mission statement. Mm-hmm. I think that and I remember the how we hemmed and hawed so often on what the mission statement should be, and what should be our mission statement, and what should be our vision. And so I think it's being clear on where you want to be. There's not always a right answer. It's just having an answer there.
Right.
And deciding where you want to go and not get distracted. We had this discussion a lot. I mean, when is a program something that's within our core mission? And, the first thing is knowing what that is. Mm-hmm. And then trying to stick with that. Because the one thing that you quickly learn is that you can't do it all. And so I think it's deciding just what it is that you want to do. And I think that she has been doing a fabulous job in that respect. Some of the things that she's just the direction that she has gone in with the pandemic has just been marvelous, and the initiatives that have gone forward, and the ability to make something good out of a very bad situation with the pandemic. And the afternoon teas are great. And the other webinars and things like this, and now keeping that momentum going as you can phase back into live programming again is something to look forward to. But I think it's remembering the core values and core vision of the center and keeping on track, because it's so easy to get distracted. Move into this area of social justice, which is a very, very, I think it's a good area to go into. But you know, and in some ways, I'm harking back to what John Barrett will always say, is that as we look at areas of social justice, how do we always bring it back to Jackson? And as you look at areas of the international criminal law, international humanitarian law, I mean, you know, that's under fire right now in a way that it hasn't been in a long, long time. And so again, you know, bringing that back to Jackson and bringing that back to where the United States was in that area and how it led in that area. And so bringing it back. So I think that, you know, the social justice, civility in our society today and in politics. And these are all very, very good areas that should be looked at and can be addressed. But bring that tie back to Jackson. And
What's the question you expected I would ask today, Jim? That I
oh
haven't?
gosh, knowing you long enough, I'm not going to answer that question.
I think it's exactly what you said 10 years ago.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. You dodged it then, and you're going to dodge it now.
I've probably dodged more than I've answered here today.
Oh, you're great. This is fabulous. This is a part of the story which I've never really gotten into, was the whole backstory of you, which has been great. Great. Well, thanks, Jim. I really appreciate
Sure.
it.